So, hi everybody. I don't know if everybody knows me here. I'm Igor. I'm part of the AngularJS team, and it's my honor to have Mark from the DoubleClick for Advertisers team from New York here. Mark is going to talk about how they use AngularJS to build DoubleClick for advertisers. It's actually called something else. He's going to explain it all. It's too complicated for me. But they've been using Angular for, 18 months, a year and a half or so? Yeah. They launched about a month ago. Speaking of launches, we actually launched a new. Can you switch back? We actually launched a new AngularJS application. It's YouTube for Play 3. So the YouTube team in San Bruno has been working on a application for PS3 that will just give you access to all the YouTube content, and they launched today. So if you have PS3, you can go to the App Store and just download it and use it. It's all built with AngularJS. They've been working on this for, I want to say, 10 months or so. So it's great to see that launched. We're actually going to have one of the team members from the team come to the meetup probably around October or so and talk about how they did it, what they used, and what challenges they faced and how they solved them. So that's going to be great. I think that's everything I had to say. Mark, let's do it.
All right. Hi, everyone. How you all doing tonight? Good, good. My name is Mark Jacobs. I'm with Google. Specifically, I am an engineer and tech lead manager for a product now called DoubleClick Digital Marketing Manager, and we'll talk a little more about what that is. So, what does this talk about? So, in 2008, Google acquired DoubleClick, and it's just this. Everything else is correct. In 2008, Google acquired DoubleClick, and it inherited a lot of tools and products and platforms that were done in a very different technology than is what you normally see at Google. We were tasked about 18 months ago with rewriting from scratch this product called DFA for Advertisers and bringing it into a technology set that made a whole lot more sense within Google. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but essentially this talk is about our experience, about what this product is, what were some of the issues we faced and some of the design decisions we made, and I'll talk a little bit more about just how we have delivered this product. So the first thing to point out is that DFA is actually pretty big for an Angular application. We actually think it is probably the largest application built on AngularJS. Just how big? It's about 200,000 lines of code. That is inclusive of views and tests and so forth, but still even controllers we have in the number of like 90,000 lines of code. So it's a fairly large application. As I mentioned, I'm at Google. I specifically work on DDMM trafficking front end, and I'll explain that a little bit later as well. All right, so what is this? DDMM trafficking front end is Google's buy-side online display advertising platform for large advertisers and agencies. I'll break that down a little bit. I won't spend too much time on it. Anybody here in the advertising world? All right, so the first key thing is the buy side represents advertisers, not publishers. Advertisers are people like Nike and Apple and so forth. And we're talking about online display advertising. So this is like banner advertising, interstitials you might see on New York Times. This is not video or social or search ads like AdWords. Trafficking is my particular realm of the world. It's part of the three main pillars of advertising: trafficking, serving, and reporting. If you're interested in hearing more about that, I'm happy to talk about it after the talk. But in essence, we're in charge of the trafficking side of things. All right, so the first thing you have to understand about where we came from in order to understand where we ended up. So DFA 6, which is the major version that's currently out for most customers, it's the legacy version as we call it. It was built on C#, ASP.NET. Its backend was written in Java on JBoss. It was deployed on Windows in a legacy data center that's not at all like our Google data centers. The data was stored in Oracle, as it says, and it's almost completely rendered server side. So this is very foreign to Google, and it's also very different from where we ended up. Again, about 18 months ago is when, as a platform, we decided we finally needed to move to technologies that made more sense within Google. There's a lot of drivers for this. One of the key ones is there were all types of new features that we wanted to develop, and we needed something that had higher velocity than we were currently capable of doing with this technology set. There was also a lot of integrations we wanted to do with other teams at Google, and trying to figure out how to talk .NET to some other service in Google is pretty difficult. Another major problem was at Google it's very difficult to hire .NET engineers. They just don't walk in the front door, and so we knew that we had to grow our team by quite a bit in order to build all what we wanted to build, and we needed to do it on a platform that allow us to attract and retain the right engineers that could help us build this going forward. So at this time, again, 18 months ago, within our group in ads, the major question was, do we build this on GWT or not? GWT, if for those, how many people know what GWT is? Okay. So we're talking about Google Web Toolkit. And at ads, it was just fait accompli. At that particular time, GWT was it, and everything in ads, if it was a new application or existing application or an extension of one, was written in GWT. From my team's perspective, this was a little problematic. The first thing is, none of my team really had experience with GWT. We didn't really have any Java programmers. We were a mix of front-end JavaScript engineers and .NET folks. And many of the other DoubleClick teams that had switched to GWT complained about it for various reasons. I'm not going to go into a major comparison about what's GWT, but the first major problem that was self-evident was it was difficult to find GWT engineers in the marketplace, just like it was difficult for Google to find engineers that were expert in .NET. It was challenging for us to find Java engineers that are truly UI engineers. Just because you know Java does not automatically make you a UI engineer. So that was one of the factors that people complained about. They also complained about sort of difficulty in using the tool, its kind of inflexibility, and it just didn't. For my team, it just didn't match with our particular skill set. So we looked at a number of different things at that time. We looked at things like Knockout and JavaScript MVC. We looked at doing plain closure. We looked at Backbone JS. And at that time, Mishko, who's one of the lead, he's the TL for AngularJS, had come to New York and was doing a tech talk on an early version of AngularJS. And we were actually pretty interested in what he had to say. And there was a number of different things that made it very attractive. The first thing is that AngularJS was a declarative solution. But what I mean by that is much of what the behavior of the application was captured in the markup. We could say things like ngClick, and we could do repeat, and that was in the markup, and it was pretty straightforward. Another major sell for me was two-way data binding. At that time, there was a lot of frameworks that allow you to bind UI from the models to the view, but not so many that did the reverse, so that when you entered data into an input, it actually updated the model. It also used plain old JavaScript objects. So again, some of these other platforms at the time, other frameworks, require that you subclass this or wrap that. I think it was Knockout in particular that has a really sophisticated dependency detection framework between different properties, but it required you to wrap all of your objects as dependency objects and things like that, which, again, if you come from the .NET world of Windows presentation framework, maybe that's familiar to you, but it really didn't make a lot of sense in a modern JavaScript world, at least for us. As well, we had a lot of jQuery experience at the time, and we were excited to see that Angular had a lot of jQuery opportunities for integration. Angular itself has a jQuery Lite compatibility layer, and you can use jQuery within widgets and directives, and that seemed pretty attractive to us because we could apply some of our knowledge that we already had into this particular framework. And I think one of the major things that blew me away was there was a complete testing story. It was one of the few frameworks to really express a full culture of testing. From even back then, from the very first version, there was when you downloaded Angular Seed, it showed you how to write unit tests using Jasmine, how to run them using JS Test Driver. There was an end-to-end testing solution in Angular scenarios. This was all from the very beginning of Angular. And I think when you're trying to build, imagine how you're going to build a large application, having that testing culture embedded in your framework is really important. And again, one other aspect that has grown up quite a bit in the last 18 months is just dependency injection and how that fits into the testing story. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And lastly, it had a straightforward architectural model. We can debate whether or not it's actually MVC. It's probably a mixture of MVP, MVVM, and everything else. But at least for us, it was pretty clear how to build walls around certain things to help with testing, the controllers, the directives, and so forth. Okay. So to get started with this, we decided to build a prototype. We took the main landing page of our application in DFA6, which I'll demo in a few minutes. And we decided to reuse the existing web services, reuse the existing CSS, much of the existing markup, and just see if we could angularize it. This process took one engineer basically 2 days. And the payoff there was not only was it quick, but it ended up being about 1/10 of the size and about 10 times faster. Nothing else we saw at that time really had the same payoff. We had actually attempted to do the same type of prototype using Gwt. We worked on it for about 2.5 weeks, and granted, we're not Gwt experts, but we basically gave up because at 2.5 weeks, we still had something that was partially working, but not completely, and we were already well done with the Angular one, and we were quite happy with the results. So the initial strategy, again, DFA, which was a scene of it, is actually quite a large application. It has many different list pages and property pages and wizards and different sections. And our initial strategy was, given our success with the prototype, was to actually upgrade this large application page by page, view by view. So in place, users will be logging in, and then from one release to another, another section will be lit up on the new technology, and they really wouldn't know because it just the same style, same, but we'd actually have like pages that were operating faster and with less code, and those were written on the new stack, while the old stack was still being essentially phased out. This actually worked pretty well. In fact, last September, we launched with this strategy, and it was very successful. In other words, customers didn't notice other than when they were in this section, things seemed to be faster. But as it turned out, we didn't follow this strategy to now. We just relaunched, and back at that time, last September, we were looking at what we want to do for the whole platform. Essentially, this page-by-page upgrade was our strategy for upgrading the trafficking UI. But it really, in the end, wasn't a great strategy for upgrading the entire DoubleClick for Advertisers platform. When we started to look at all the things we wanted to do across that, from trafficking to serving and reporting, we decided, let's go from scratch. Fortunately, Angular in our architecture allowed us to just swap out a few key pieces, and we were able to save all of the work we had done from a page-by-page upgrade. So as we kicked off the development for this, many of you, if you work in enterprises, might be familiar with this. This strategy actually created a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, FUD, as it's sometimes called. There's a lot of reasons for this. I think one of them was we were not doing Gwt, and we're in an organization where everything was Gwt, and why are you guys zigging when everyone else has zagged? I think another major reason for this was that the Angular team is and has always been quite small, and I think from a large revenue-oriented organization, depending on a framework that's maintained by 2 people, or now 4 or 5 or whatever it is, seemed extremely risky. And I think as well, there was just a question about whether this was the right thing for ads. As it turned out, AngularJS is no longer a dirty word. During this period, we never even mentioned the word Angular. We just built it and said we're using a custom JavaScript framework. And then in September, when we launched, And everyone said, wow, this is awesome. How'd you guys do this so quickly? Oh, it's because we used Angular. And after that, it's been a total success. Across ads, we've had many different projects light up with Angular. New projects are generally considering Angular as our first choice. Julie from Seattle over there is working on a project as well. It's built on Angular. And this was truly inconceivable when we got started. All right, so I'm going to give two demos. The first one is the old thing. It's DFA 6. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but at least gives you a bit of sort of before and after. And the second demo is going to be DFA 7, and I'll demo a little bit about what our app does and some of the features it has. All right. So this is DFA 6, and it is not pretty. It is not fast. It is written on ASP.NET, and while that's a successful stack for many people, it didn't really work that great for DFA. But as you can see, I'm sorry that it's cut off here in Mountain View, but we have three major sections of our application: campaigns, advertisers, and an administrative section. You can think of DFA as basically forms over data. Our consumer is a trafficker who is trying to upload artwork and generate all the custom metadata around how to build an online campaign. And we have objects like campaigns and advertisers and placements, which represent areas on a publisher website, creatives, which represent the actual artwork and some data around that, ads, which represent targeting information. And so in this application, for example, I can go and look at a particular, it doesn't actually make it better. It's cut off there too. Well, I could do that. You're right. All right. Sure. Sorry about that. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but essentially you've got long pages like this that show the properties of a campaign. We can see lists of objects. In this case, we're looking at creatives. And creatives themselves, all these things have many different properties. This is the old version. So now let's take a look at the new version. So we weren't trying to radically change the interactions, at least not at first. We were just trying to, make it much faster. We had a large effort in UX research and design to improve the usability of this application. We're also trying to just make it more consistent in look and feel. So again, across the top, we've got the same campaigns, advertisers, and admin. I'll demo a few things that I think are interesting from an AngularJS perspective. One is we wrote our own grid control. And let's see. So this grid control has some nice properties. First, if I scroll down the page, the headers actually stick across the top. Another nice thing is if I can have many different columns. As I scroll, it actually has a sticky left-hand side. If I go into like a particular campaign, sorry, this is all test data because I can't actually show you real customer data. You see we've kind of cleaned up a lot of the design. We've got some new controls. For example, let me see if I can find one. We have, oh, I know, hold on. Another major control that we wrote is what we call an omni list. And if I, for example, go to pull this up, it's a combo box with searching ability. And it also has the ability to add new things, do multi-select. And there's a number of other things. For example, we also have the ability, a little difficult to demo right now, that when two users are looking at the same object from different parts of the world, if one saves, the other one gets a notification. Hey, Mark just saved this object. Would you like to refresh it? And a number of other things. All right, so I'm going to go back to the uncomfortable view for you guys because it actually looks correct on everyone else's screen. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the architecture. The first key piece of this redesign was a redesign of the trafficking backend. So as we mentioned before, the DFA 6 version stored data in Oracle, had a SOAP API. The new backend really was the driver for everything. It picked a new Google internal storage mechanism and has a RPC mechanism. Again, it's Google internal. But it has a compatibility layer that still exposes that SOAP API. So the big question for us is yes. Yes.
The question was if there was a jQuery and HTML5 mixed.
There was both HTML5 and jQuery on display there. Very subtle, but we'll hopefully get to dig into that a little bit. So the first question we asked ourselves is, we have this back-end service that has an RPC mechanism that you don't put right on the internet. So we needed some intermediary to basically allow the browsers to connect to this back-end service. So what we wrote was a trafficking front-end REST API. This was a custom server written in Java using Sun Jersey, which is a REST framework. GSE, which is Google's servlet engine. So there's I think there's an equivalent open source called Open Servlet Engine or something like that. But it's basically just a servlet container. And Juice, which is the dependency injection framework. Very simple, supports things like, sorry, you can't see this, oops. It supports things like creating a new campaign via post, getting a particular campaign, getting a list of campaigns, querying that, save it, that kind of thing. Its primary function is several. One is authentication, aggregation of data sources, simplification of complex RPC. So for example, our backend system, sometimes if you want to perform a batch operation on many different things, the REST API simplifies some of those interactions. So instead of being 10 different calls to a backend, we can package them up as one call from the UI. And as well, it deals with transformation of data formats. Our backend service has sort of a compact binary representation that doesn't work on the internet. So we actually transform these things to JSON and decorate those JSON objects with many different things like self links, next and previous links, and we also sometimes fold in related objects so that we don't have to do multiple calls. From the UI perspective, we already knew we were using Angular, but there were still a lot of design issues that we had to figure out. One of the first ones is, how do we deal with single page architecture? So this is very different than the DFA6 version, where every page was rendered by the server. In the single page architecture, there's really two issues that we had to deal with. One was, how do we deal with common view content, and the second one was bookmarkability. So common view content. So in our DFA6, we had this notion of nested master pages. So if you go back to the app, you will see that, we have a header region up here with a shared menu that works across the entire application. But the next region down is actually only specific to the campaign section. And then furthermore, we've got a header, which is itself a subsection. So in DFA6, this would have been sort of nested views. AngularJS doesn't really support nested views, so we need to figure out how to represent this. And one of the things we learned was that directives were the key mechanism for reusability in AngularJS. So we had to figure out what goes in index.html, that is what is going to be shared across the entire app. And this tended to be things like, we have a warning we show when you're using an outdated browser, or you don't have JavaScript enabled. We also put in index.html our notification area, like in Gmail, you get the little loading and item archive, that kind of stuff. But basically, everything else is outside of index.html. When we want to get the same header across multiple different pages in a section of the website, we use a directive, and that directive wraps up not only the markup but also the behavior around that shared header. Around bookmarkability, again, in DFA6, there was no support at all for bookmarkability. Much of it was session-oriented, and you couldn't, in fact, in DFA6, open two tabs within the application. It would get very confused very quickly. So the bookmarkability was a key design goal of DFA7. And so we had to lay out all of our URLs so that we can understand how you bookmark things. But we also had to figure out which state is bookmarkable, because not everything is bookmarkable. For example, if I'm looking at a properties page and I click a button and I get a dialog, for us, dialogues are not bookmarkable state. If you were to bookmark it while the dialog is open, you'd come back to the properties page or a particular list results view that existed before the dialog was popped up, not the state with the dialog popped in. We also there's also other states. For example, we have a feature called I didn't demo. I should called Campaign Explorer, which is really like the new hotness for DFA. And in this feature, we have the ability to do bulk editing, and bulk editing is a mode. So I can look at, for example, I can make a query that says, give me these 15 campaigns or 15 ads, and I can do bulk editing on that. If I bookmark it while the bulk editor is open, I don't really want to, if I send you that particular URL, I don't want you to end up in the editing mode. I just want you to see the same query results for those 15 objects. So there's a lot of these type of decisions that go into figuring out the bookmarkability of the site. And one other aspect that comes up, for example, if I go into a particular campaign, I have this carousel thing on the right. And this carousel is actually going through the items of my query from the list page I just came from. And so we had a big debate about, is this a bookmarkable state or not? And we came up with a hybrid solution, which was it's bookmarkable for the person who bookmarked it, but if I send you that bookmark, you're not going to get all the carousel state, because that may not be meaningful to you to have that same list context around that object. So if I bookmark this and send it to you, in fact, we just strip off all the carousel data that's encoded in the location bar. And so you can still send a direct link to this particular campaign, but you won't get the carousel because it may not be meaningful to you. You may not have the permissions to actually rotate through that carousel and so forth. So this was a major design issue we had to think through. The next thing was how we were going to use jQuery and what was its purpose within the application and what limits would we put on its use. The first thing that I think it's important to recognize is that while AngularJS has a jQuery-like support and it supports does that work? Okay. While AngularJS has a jQuery-like programming model for certain actions and it supports being augmented with the real jQuery, it really isn't intended for general use, right? There's an Angular way of programming, and there's a jQuery way of programming. And the focus really is on using jQuery within directives. So we learned that lesson pretty quick. And at first, we started bringing in a lot of jQuery UI, third-party controls, and other things like that. But over time, for various reasons, we chose to depend on jQuery a whole lot less. One is it just didn't seem as relevant. I'll talk on the next slide. We use some other tools that have a lot of overlap with jQuery, and there's a more compelling reason to use those other tools. So we started depending on jQuery a lot less. And the less we depended on it, the more we could see the light at the end of the tunnel where we wouldn't depend on it at all. We can just eliminate the overhead of jQuery. So as it stands, we are trying to lessen our reliance on jQuery, and hopefully we'll get to an end state where, to the extent that we need it, we're using the Angular jQuery Lite or some other mechanism to do DOM manipulation. But right now, jQuery is just used within directives to do DOM manipulation, some event work, and that's about it. We don't use much animation. What animation we do use, we try to keep it limited to, I'm sorry, the question was animations a consideration at all in our use of jQuery? What animations we do use, we try to use CSS3 transitions because realistically the only target browser that doesn't support those is IE, of our target browsers is like IE8, and we just don't care. So if we get a degraded experience on IE, as long as it's functional, I don't think it really cares. I mean, I think that's it was an important design goal for us. To the extent possible, we want to make sure everyone has equal access to functionality. But if you're working on a browser that doesn't support rounded corners or transitions or whatever, we're not going to do backflips. Just upgrade your browser and you'll be fine. Yeah. So the other consideration was what other tools and libraries that we already knew we liked, how would those fit into the architecture of DFA? So one of the first things we just happen to love and we use a lot is _JS. A lot of us have on the team really like a functional programming style, and _.js supports all of that, maps, folds, that kind of thing. And as well, it has a lot of things like is number, is string, and utility functions that were very handy. The second thing that we use, at first begrudgingly, was Clojure. So there's a lot of reasons we, at first, just wanted to stay away from Clojure. One is it's very verbose. It's very different than other frameworks. If you're coming from a jQuery background, Clojure just looks ugly. But as time has gone on, we've actually depended more and more on Clojure for a handful of reasons. One is Clojure plays very nicely with Clojure compiler, surprise, surprise. And we are heavily wedded to Clojure compiler. We'll talk a little bit later. And so that kind of played our hand a little bit. As well, like Google, Clojure has many different core utilities like Goog is string, Goog is number, that while there's overlap with jQuery and _, the Clojure versions have a benefit of the Clojure compiler actually understands those particular API calls and it helps the compiler static analysis of your code. So when you say goog.isString, not only are you detecting is it a string, but the Clojure compiler is saying, I'm expecting after this particular line is called that the thing you'll be dealing with is a string, and it can actually use that to help with type detection and other kinds of errors. So another reason we started using Clojure a whole lot more is within Google. One of the key ways of sharing JavaScript controls across the entirety of Google is by wrapping them as Clojure widgets. And so we take those Clojure widgets, wrap them in Angular, and everything is just fine. So over the course of time, we've expanded the scope of Clojure. We still don't use any of Clojure's UI widgets or anything, but we use more and more of their libraries for things like messing with URLs, date objects, doing string formats, and some data structures and that kind of thing. Another thing we added in the last couple quarters is Less. How many people are familiar with Less? So Less is a CSS compiler, and Google has its own CSS compiler, like in every other company, I guess. But a lot of us had already had experience with Less. We liked the syntax. It was pretty easy to bring in. And the main benefit to us is we have a relatively large application and a large team that works on different parts of the application. And over time, as we were trying to manage all these styles, one part of the app would get updated with the new UX design, and another part would sort of fall behind. Or the UX designer would say, oh, we're updating the color for this, and we had to go and find all instances of that color. So the Less CSS compiler really sped up our ability to quickly adapt to new UX designs and ensure consistency across the whole app. And as later on we started to design Angular controls that can be shared across multiple Angular projects at Google, the CSS compiler allowed us to easily construct a subset of our CSS that could be shared and packaged with just that control. The last, I think, key thing is HTML5 boilerplate. I hope that all of you guys know about it and use it. It's a really kind of wonderful thing. We don't use it for much. I mean, it basically defines our index.html. We definitely use it for its IE classes. So at the top, it basically says, it defines, .ie6 if you're using that browser, .ie8. When we have to, hammer Internet Explorer into shape, we often use those things. Other than that, I mean, the truth of the matter is AngularJS is very compatible with a range of different tools and libraries, and we haven't had to add that much. So build, compilation, and minification. So the actual compilation and minification is done using Clojure compiler. At Google, we have a build system, and that build system has build files. It's not make. It has its own name and its own purpose. But essentially, we have tasks that do several different things. The first thing is it goes and compiles all of our JavaScript. And it also does localization, which we'll talk about in a little bit later, and generates a deployment package that we can then put directly on the internet. So it's static stuff. Yeah. So another key question we had was how much server-side templating to use, if any. So the key design, I think, of Angular is really doing all of this client side. But there's some things you would toy about talking about if we would do them server side. So in the beginning, up until very recently, the entire application was all done client side. Nothing was rendered server side. All of our files were static. And there's a lot of benefits to this. One of them is you can do static edge serving. So we can take our entire package of views, CSS images and stuff, put them under an immutable version URL. So like version 2012 October or something like that, and say that this package represents something that'll never change. And once you do that, you can actually set the cache expiry to infinity. And that's great for we have customers like in China, for example, that have relatively slow links to Google. And if we can put all of our static files on these edge servers and give them infinite cache expiry, that means unless we switch to a new version, every time the customer brings that up, they have all the files already in their browser except for that first load. As time went on, though, we realized that there was certain functionality that we couldn't achieve without server-side templating. So as of our most current release, we've actually switched to rendering just our index.html. And we use a technology called SOI. I think publicly it's known as closure templates. There really wasn't a sophisticated bake-off in that decision. It was just really easy to use, and we didn't really have difficult requirements for server-side templating. And what we use it for is twofold. One, we use it to drive authentication. So in our before this release, the way we authenticated you, we served up index.html, regardless of whether you're authenticated or not. And the app would boot up, and the very first time would say, to the REST API, who are you? Who am I? And if that REST API said, oh, you're not authenticated, it would return a forbidden, and then we redirect the whole app into our login infrastructure. With server-side rendering, we can eliminate that entire round trip. The index.html can know whether or not you're authenticated or not and immediately redirect you before even serving up the index.html. So that was a vast improvement to performance. Another thing is, in order for our application to work, we need to know what permissions you have, what features you're enabled for, who you are, what's your username, what's your user ID, and a whole bunch of other things. Normally, that's just an additional round trip we do after the page is loaded. With our new mechanism, we just literally slipstream that information into index.html. So that it improves performance and eliminates a round trip. Another reason is we have this need within large applications to be able to conditionally deliver different features. So for example, we have some feature that should be only enabled for a couple customers while they beta test it, and then we roll the whole thing out. Or a better example is a feature is done, we're going to roll it out to everybody, but we're not going to roll it out on the same day that we push the deployment. For example, maybe there's a marketing event and they want to do it on exactly October 1st. But we release on September 27th. So one of the things we need to figure out is how to conditionally launch these things after they're already deployed. And the way we do that is in server-side templating, we embed all of your features and permissions in that index.html. And we've also done work to bundle portions of the application. So we can take an entire feature represented as a bundle, or even a version bundle. So for example, we can say that this entire admin section, for example, represents a bundle. And in index.html, we test whether you have that feature or not, and then conditionally include instructions to load that bundle. And the bundle is views, CSS, images, that kind of thing. Now, once we have all this server-side templating, I don't think we plan to extend it past index.html because we'd still like to take advantage of the edge serving. But server-side templating as well will help us with the edge serving by helping inject the immutable version URLs required for infinite cache expiry. So third-party controls, these are things like your grid controls, your list controls, your date time controls, and whatever. We started with just a few, but as time gone on, we've just used fewer and fewer. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, we've tried to depend less on jQuery, and our initial batch of stuff was all jQuery UI oriented. We still got a few, like we have a date time widget that's based on jQuery UI. We hate it. We're trying to rewrite it right now. And as just time goes on, we're doing more and more stuff that's custom. I think one, it's very nice working within a complete AngularJS framework, having your own directives, that are pure Angular. I think just works better, and it works. You have more tight control over the performance of the application and how stuff flows up and down scopes. And some of our controls were just we couldn't find anything on the market that did exactly what our UX designers wanted us to do. For example, our list and grid controls have a lot of complex interactions that yes, we as Google could go out and shop around for this thing, but at a certain point, it just made more sense for us to develop it. The few controls that we still use are generally internal controls for things like there's something called Google Feedback, which is like you say give feedback and it takes a screenshot of a part of your app and you can complain to us and we'll get this in a big back-end system. We still use that, and yes.
Are you going to try and open source any of your Angular widgets?
I would love to, and I think the real question is not so much whether or not the source code is shareable, but the real question is what does a truly great third-party Angular control look like, and how is it deployed? I think that's the question we've had. It's very difficult to solve. Even we've taken a lot of our controls, like these lists and grids, and just tried to share them across multiple Google projects. And we figured out how to do it to a certain extent, but it lacks the configurability that no one would normally expect of a true, great, grid control. Take like, XJS or any of those really high-quality grid controls. We just don't know yet, and I say we, it's not just DFA. I don't think the Angular team itself really knows how you would, write and distribute a high-quality grid control that had all the configurability and themability that people would expect. I just don't know what that looks like yet. And so within Google, we're sharing it mostly between projects that all have kind of the same look and feel. But we'd love to figure out, as the time goes on, how we would actually package this thing in a way that more people can enjoy. All right, so another major thing we spent a lot of time working on is internationalization. And how many people work on applications that are used in more than one country? Oh, good. So as you guys know, internationalization really falls into two separate pieces. One is translation, which is relatively easy, and then the other one is localization, which at least for us turns out to be much harder. So for translation, the way it works in our project is we mark up anything that needs to be translated with a custom wiki-like link syntax that we created. So that we can see. Let me highlight this. So it's basically bracket bracket, and then we have the string that's to be translated. And then there's a vertical bar, you can see this right here, and everything after the vertical bar to the next bracket bracket is an instruction to the translator. So it's oftentimes called the meaning. And the reason for this is because the same word could be translated differently depending on the context and what things. So there was really no built-in mechanism inside of Angular to support message extraction. So we ended up writing something custom. So what happens is when we do a build, all of these, our custom message extractor goes through looking for all things that look like this wiki link syntax. It extracts them all into a message bundle format, and it gets sent to an internal system that does, that basically it's like a database. And this database has a UI that our translators from around the world use to translate our application. So an individual message will appear in the database. A translator will go enter in the translation. The translation will get approved. And then on the other side of our build, when we actually building our JavaScript and our views, we load the translations for each locale that we support, and we essentially compile these things. We re-inject the translated term into the view or into the JavaScript, and we create a static locale-specific version of that HTML file or that JavaScript file. So when you look at our deployment package, we have our sort of our sort of shared folder has a subfolder for each locale. So we have an ENUS, ENUK, ES, and so forth. And in each one of those subfolders, you have a full copy of the entire set of static files, but those ones have translated terms in both the JavaScript and views. And so how do we actually serve that? So when you log in to our application, we have you as a user profile setting, we know which locale you've selected. And then we set a cookie called XFA locale that says, oh yeah, you're the ENUS guy. And every subsequent time you request a static file, our static file servlet says, oh, I'm getting a request from ENUS. I'm going to redirect to the subfolder called ENUS and just serve the file out of that subfolder. And that's just the way it works. One second. The second part of internationalization is localization. And while this is not normally a hard problem, it turns out to be a little bit of a hard problem for us. And the reason is that DFA supports several different locales situations. So for example, I could be a trafficker sitting in New York, my client is in London, and we're talking about a campaign in Poland. And furthermore, like I could be traveling between those different realms. So normally, if you're just localizing in a client browser for either the invariant locale or the browser locale, life is easy. But we actually support situations where I could be sitting in New York and want to show things in a German locale, even though my browser and operating system say US. And the reality is we don't really support that well currently, and we're working with on several different tools. AngularJS has a bunch of tools. Clojure has a bunch of tools to support all these different variants of showing locales. If you were doing a server-side rendering, this would be much simpler. But another thing I don't mention here is we support, or will soon support, the ability to switch between time zones. For again, to this use case where if I'm in New York, somebody's in, my client's in London, and my campaign's in Poland, I can bring up a page that shows when this ad is starting, when this campaign is, and I want to switch between time zones because I want to make sure that it starts at 1 in the afternoon in Poland, not 1 in the afternoon in London or New York. And supporting that really meant that we had to figure out how to coordinate with the server to properly render things in time zones other than my browser time zone or the the UTC. And the last sort of major thing that we had to consider was how we were going to handle caching. On the good side, when you have a client side JavaScript application, you have a lot of flexibility of how you can do caching and where you can do it. So we do caching on the server. So for example, our REST API, whenever it makes requests to our backend, anything that's slowly changing, such as dimension data, the list of languages, the picker for different types, that's all cached in memory in our REST API. As well, we do a very conscientious use of HTTP caching. So every time we send a static file, we set a expiry on it. Depending on which environment you're in, we have a dev, QA, prod environment. We can set that anywhere between 0 and 24 hours. There's also browser caching. So every time you request like a RESTful endpoint that has JSON data attached to it, we send like a last modified since, if modified since, as well as an e tag. And the REST API actually compares after it pulls down the data, it can detect whether or not it's changed. If the data hasn't changed, it just sends a not modified back to the client, and we reduce the bandwidth to actually satisfy the request. As well, inside of Angular, there's an HTTP service that does caching as well. We do some, in our case, some transformations on that data inside that cache. And finally, within the application itself, we do caching. For example, like once we populate a drop-down for a filter, we try not to reload it again once it's already loaded. Okay, so how do we DFA write and test code? First, let me talk about a little bit about our team. So in Google frame of reference, we're a medium-sized team. We're currently based in New York City. We've got about 14 software engineers, 4 test engineers, 4 UX researchers and designers, and we're kind of lucky in that regard, and 1 documentation writer, plus a whole army of people, from product managers, support folks, localization project managers, and we often, to build anything, we need to work with other Google teams. So it's definitely an operation that involves a lot of people. The division of labor, I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially when features begin, generally speaking, our product managers write PRDs or product requirements documents. Those documents feed into the UX design process, the user experience design process. They'll work on mocks while negotiating with engineering as we're thinking through our design docs of how the feature can be implemented. There's a negotiation between engineering UX as we figure out what's the right solution that balances technical reality and artistic endeavor. And then out of that, we actually begin implementation. While implementation is getting started, not while it's ending, our test engineering organization works on test plans. Those test plans ultimately feed into product acceptance. So one of the things we do on our team, we have twice a week what we call bug hunts. Every engineer on the team, twice a week, takes off their developer hat, puts on their test hat, and is randomly assigned a test plan and does manual testing on that feature. This is in addition to our automated test coverage. We have, as I'll talk about, 99% plus automated test coverage. But automated unit tests in particular don't cover everything. So we try, and the bug hunts not only give our team a chance to test more of the application, but also to build familiarity. When you've got 14 engineers, they built this feature. They may have little awareness, if at all, of another feature built by somebody on another part of the team. So the bug hunts build general knowledge for the entire product. So as far as development environments, we do not have a team standard, and this kind of sucks. We've got people working on Eclipse, IntelliJ, WebStorm. We've got folks who are doing text editors like Sublime, TextMate. Myself, it's Vim, and working with in a browser window. And the reality is, this is kind of a crappy situation. We'd love to be able to at least have a recommended IDE. It's fine if people want to do their own thing, but we've had a lot of growth on our team recently. And number one complaint I hear from the new folks that join our team is like, I wish you would just give us like a recommended platform. It's fine if I deviate from it later, but when you're just starting on a project, you're trying to learn so much about the code and the business or whatever. Why do I also have to figure out which development environment works and how to configure it? And the shame at this point is we don't really have a great thing to suggest. They all have their pluses and minuses, and I think this is an area that we need to work on, both our team as well as Google. Automated testing. So there's a combination of automated unit testing as well as integration testing. All of our unit tests are written in the Angular suggested way, using Jasmine to write our unit tests. We currently use JS Test Driver to run our tests. JS Test Driver was the Angular approach from the dawn of time, but that's changing, and it's changing for very good reasons. I think that JS Test Driver is flaky, not as performant to some other choices, and now we've got things like Testacular, which kind of takes that JS Test Driver model and puts it in over Node, and it's a little bit more, a lot more reliable and faster. We've also looked at other methods. There's some other groups at Google who are using AngularJS with some other test mechanisms. There's something called GJS Test, which you can find on code.google.com, which runs those unit tests not in a remote browser, but actually locally in V8. There's some other approaches as well. And ultimately, the only thing we care about is how can we run our tests as quickly as possible for test-driven development. We'd love to be able to hit save, and a quarter of a second later, our 1,600 tests would just magically run. In reality, it doesn't quite work that way. I also think that some of the problems that we've had with JS Test Driver are symptoms of having a lot of tests. I think this worked much better when we had 200 tests, 400 tests, but now that we're in the thousands of tests, we need to examine some other ways of doing it. But still, the one benefit of this model is when you do run tests, you can run them simultaneously on multiple browsers. Our automated unit tests are run on pre-submit, so every time we attempt to submit code, the full unit test suite is run on our internal cloud, and if any of those tests fails, it refuses to submit, which is pretty cool. We have our own internal code coverage tool, that tells us, oh yes, these 4 files are all perfect of this particular change list, but this one file has only 60% coverage, and it's these 3 methods that need to be tested. Like I said, we maintain over 99% unit test coverage. Our integration test story is not as wonderful. We've had historically a lot of desire to use AngularJS scenarios, but not a lot of success using it. Has anybody used Angular scenarios in the room? Okay, then you don't feel my pain. But end-to-end tests are very important, right? Because unit tests, validate your application up to a point, but ultimately you need to know, all right, if the user clicks on this button, do they see like this next route, or if I create a bunch of objects through the UI over here, do they actually appear in the list? Unit tests don't really are not intended to go that far. Ultimately, what we've settled on is we write our integration tests in Java and use a technology called WebDriver, which is again it's open, on the web. And this is okay. The main problem with this scenario is I have an army of JavaScript engineers, and JavaScript engineers are supposed to write their own integration tests. And when my integration tests are written in Java, and using WebDriver, there's a disconnect there, there's an impedance mismatch. So we're trying to work on how we can write that and look at different approaches other than Angular scenarios that will move that responsibility back into my team's camp. Let's see. Okay, so just looking back at our experience with AngularJS, there are advantages and disadvantages. I think some of the key advantages are, first and foremost, it leverages, standard web technologies. When I go out and try to grow my team, it's nice to be able to know that I can bring in people that already have exposure to the tech stack, not necessarily specifically AngularJS, but they have exposure to HTML5, CSS3, and other related, modern, JavaScript, the good parts. There's a lot of advantages to this. I think as well, for the same reason we're able to bring in people and get them up to speed quickly. They still have to learn our business and our object model and our code base, but at least they're not struggling as much with like learning Git, for example. Another thing that we've learned to love is that testing is deeply embedded in the Angular way. From the very beginning, Angular shows you how to not only run tests, but how to help model your code such that it becomes testable. And I think, again, as you're growing teams or trying to bring on new people, having that model be self-evident within your project code base helps a lot in making sure you've got quality code. The velocity of development has been really good. I don't think we could have done as much as we've done without Angular. Certainly, if I think it's reasonable to say, like, if we were doing this on Git, we would not have gotten as far. We have some other projects in our platform who have done Git, and they've been reasonably successful. They were more experienced Git developers than us, but they've basically gotten to a point where UX engineers or UX designers are telling them, all right, now build this grid control, now build this list control, and there's like, we don't have the time. It would take us months and months to do what it took us only a milestone or two. I think another key thing is AngularJS just has a really passionate team. You look at the community building up around AngularJS. That's in large part because like Igor, Mishko, and Vojta have just been doing a great job at outreach and being passionate about a better way of coding, and that goes a long way in being passionate about your own code. And of course, the fact that so many of you are here for an AngularJS meetup is a testament to the community that's building up around this technology. When we were using it, nobody was using it. And I think even as much as like 2-3 quarters ago, I could keep track of Angular, mailing list. I could actually like maybe respond to. Now it's like I blink and there's like 400, requests on there, and I think that community is really starting to sharpen us all on different approaches for using Angular. Some disadvantages. I guess if you've used AngularJS, you may be aware of these. The first one, like AngularJS scenarios, as I mentioned, it's pretty much ignored. It's not well documented, and we even had like personalized training from the AngularJS team, and it just never it has a very high conceptual hurdle to use it very well. And my goal was to get my entire team writing integration tests, and it just never took. So that could be definitely improved. When it comes to unit testing, there's the Angular does an excellent job, like I said, of embedding unit testing in the culture of development. But one thing that isn't as well, isn't as sharp right now, at least, is the specific testing technology to be used. Again, in history, it was JS Test Driver. Going forward, it's Testacular. But right now, we're kind of in flux between those different technologies. And Angular Seed hasn't been completely updated. And the way it works inside of Google versus outside of Google is very different. So this is,
So there's a pull request actually to replace JS Test Driver and Testacular with Testacular and Angular Seed. So that's going to happen this week. And the plan is to get rid of JS Test Driver in anywhere we use it this month. So
cool.
Testacular is going to be the way forward.
Excellent. And the final thing, it's disadvantage is that AngularJS documentation is imperfect. It's, I think a lot of the automated documentation around, this class and this method, whatever, is pretty good. But it's missing a lot of key conceptual content, and sometimes the links between them, aren't that great. There isn't a book you can yet buy that says, give me, Angular from the ground up. And I think as time has gone on, as I'll mention here, Angular has gotten much more flexible and powerful, but it's also gotten a lot more complex. Has anybody here used Angular like over a year ago? All right.
One hand.
That's impressive. Angular, when we started, was actually much simpler. And simpler, but also more confining and more constraining. And I think that, Igor blames me and my team for this, but as time has gone on, we've just kind of, exerted pressure on the envelope of what Angular's been capable of, and the AngularJS team has really responded to that task by, bringing in more sophisticated, dependency injection, modules, a whole bunch of, the widgets and directives used to be separate things. Now they're one thing, and there's been a whole bunch of changes. And the end result is like being starting a brand new Angular project today, I think requires a lot more understanding and a lot more conceptual hurdles than it once did if you were doing this a year ago. Again, I think that it's because Angular is a stronger project, but it definitely is a barrier of entry. Dependency injection. I think dependency injection is awesome, but if you are the average, I think, JavaScript engineer probably hasn't had a lot of reason to use it, and certainly hasn't had a lot of reason to use it inside a JavaScript application. If you are a Java application developer who's done Juice, Angular's JS's DI implementation is just like Juice, but not everyone who comes to AngularJS is going to have that experience. And I think it's one thing if dependency injection was kind of optional or was a recommended practice, but it's pretty much front and center with AngularJS. And I think what that means is when you are bringing new engineers to AngularJS projects, you're going to have to make sure that they understand what DI is and how it's used.
Why do you think dependency injection is awesome?
Well, it's kind of hard to imagine how you would test something without, test a limited component without subbing out, related functionality. So, for example, I want to test, the class, a particular UI widget, that normally loads data from some external resource. Well, when I'm running a test, I don't actually want to go out and talk to a server, connect to that data. That would make my 1 minute test run take all day. So using dependency injection, I can say, all right, in this particular instance, I want to use a different service or a different thing. Maybe it's a mock, maybe it's a different flavor. As well, sometimes I might want to take a component and it can have different flavors of behavior depending on which instance it's in. Using dependency injection, I can say, okay, I want you in this particular instance to use this service that maybe connects to a campaigns, a trafficking backend, but in this instance, I want you to talk to a reporting backend. So dependency injection allows you to postpone some of those connectivity decisions to the last possible moment when they're actually instantiated.
Do you also see benefits from better structure and better composability of your application and creating these components? Do you see that in a larger application like DoubleClick?
Yeah, I mean, those two things kind of come hand in hand. I mean, the whole point is I want to make components that have the smallest possible test area so that they're easily testable. So just because I'm ultimately going to take a piece of data and put it on a web page doesn't mean I want to test that component by interacting with the DOM. I want to test it as close to its interface as possible. And I think that breaking the application into a constellation of small different components that can be individually tested, and then composing them with sometimes with mocks, sometimes with the real thing, helps speed development. Another reality of AngularJS, it doesn't attempt to solve all the key problems in large-scale web application design. It doesn't even try. I mean, there's a lot of things you're still going to have to solve, for scalability and performance. And one of the things that my team's been struggling with recently is, we have a one feature that essentially collapses. It's like a redesign of our application. There's one part of our app that's 10 different tabs and as many different property pages. And we're collapsing that into a single unified experience. And one of the struggles we have is now we've got this sort of monolithic controller that's like 3,000 lines. And we're trying to figure out how do we actually decompose that into something that makes a whole lot more sense, pushing things out to models, writing custom resources that do a little bit more of the heavy lifting. So AngularJS doesn't have any solutions for you for that, at least not yet. And the last thing, mixing client server-side templating can be very messy. And as yet, I don't think AngularJS or really, any of the major frameworks out there do anything to help you with this. And I think that's going to be, something that's going to be unavoidable in the months to come. Trying to figure out how exactly we're going to mix, those two rendering strategies. Any questions? Yes.
So we started off with GWT, and then we started looking at Dart, but what we really wanted to focus on was HTML5, and we saw AngularJS as probably the easiest integration between HTML5 compared to GWT and Dart. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, our goal was definitely to have an application that was fluent in HTML5, that could take advantage of CSS3. And the nice thing about AngularJS is that it really doesn't much care whether you're using HTML4 or 5. It doesn't. There's obviously some new features you can add if it supports HTML5, such as better routes in the location bar, and but for the most part, AngularJS kind of gets out of your way. As a sort of a side example, we just started working on some data visualization. We wanted to show like stream graphs and other things about our campaigns, and we decided to use AngularJS to generate SVG. Right, and we're actually building up visualizations by doing ng repeats and binds and stuff on SVG. And the key point is that AngularJS is really agnostic to which form of markup. You could use it on XML, you could use it on HTML5, and it really doesn't care. And as far as the portions of HTML5 that don't deal with markup, like the various different history API and all those things, again, I think AngularJS has a clear programming model, how to wrap things as services, how to deal with persistent state, and it just nicely gets out of your way. Whereas I think with something like GWT, you have to write sort of native JS code wrappers for all that stuff, and it's just kind of ugly. So the fact that AngularJS is nothing more than JavaScript, and it kind of gets out of the way, I think is a huge boon.
Dart's the same way, right? If you want to do HTML5 in Dart, it gets pretty painful. I'm asking. That was our experience. Did you guys look at Dart?
We did not. I mean, it didn't. When we started this project, it didn't really exist. You know, I haven't. Yeah, I don't love Dart, but.
Thanks.
Yes. Oh. Sorry. Oh, wait, I want to get the guy in the back first, and then.
Cool.
Sorry.
So 2 quick questions. You mentioned that you have about 200,000 lines of code now.
Yep.
Can you share, is the code bigger or smaller now that you switched to AngularJS?
It's much smaller. So again, that 200,000 lines of code incorporates, you know, our HTML that has, you know, Angular markup in it. It incorporates our test. I mean, essentially, if you look at just the JavaScript code, it's about 96,000 lines. The DFA 6 version, you know, was, I want to say it was around 350,000 lines of C# code, not including all of the ASP.NET templates and whatever. I think ultimately with Angular we have, you know, much smaller code that is, I think, much faster and easier to understand.
And second question, you mentioned a couple of times the desire to get rid of JQuery.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other motivation other than the file size?
Well, ultimately, it's a bit of overhead that we may not need. You know, it is, I don't know, does anybody off the head know? It's like 76K or it's relatively large, and ultimately we're just using less and less of it over time. I mean, a lot of jQuery's weight comes from supporting browsers we don't support. It has a lot of functionality that we just no longer can use because we're confined to using jQuery only within directives. We're not doing a lot of the types of, you know, of heavy lifting that jQuery is famous for. We're just not programming in that way anymore. And when we do need certain, you know, utility functions and things like that, there's other things that we already have to include in our project, such as closure, that it just doesn't make much sense anymore within the Angular context to really keep depending on jQuery.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Imagine you have like unlimited time, unlimited human resources, and let's say you don't have to support Internet Explorer. So, which framework or which technology would you pick to rewrite the DoubleClick? Like JavaScript, Angular, Backbone. What else do we have? Pure MVC, Knockout.
I'd say even with the benefit of hindsight, I still think we would pick Angular. I think the one thing that would be very different if we started the application today is that you know, our application, you know, matured at the same pace as Angular. So when we started, you know, figuring out how we're going to write DFA, you know, these guys were figuring out how to write AngularJS. And what that meant was, you know, we paid an upgrade price every time they got a new idea. And every time they figured out, oh, there's a better way of doing this. You know, fortunately, these guys helped us a lot. If we were to start all over again today, I think our code would be a lot cleaner, a lot more concise. I think we'd make better use of a lot of the features. But I still think we'd use AngularJS. I mean, I think that you know, some of these other technologies like Backbone has picked up, you know, quite a bit. But it's a different programming model that I don't think is necessarily better. I don't think it's worse. It's much more JavaScript oriented versus markup oriented. I think that the only real thing we crave, and I think this is like for a lot of people, is maybe a you know, programming framework that was better at going back and forth between client and server. You know, but I think that nobody's got this figured out yet, and as soon as we have somebody who does, they'll be in a good position.
WebSockets plugging. Can you tell us a bit more about your development development cycle?
Mm-hmm.
Because you just mentioned that once every 2 weeks, developers take off their developer hats and put on testers hats.
Yeah.
But what else? What do you have?
Okay, so we use an agile methodology. Which method we use really depends on the makeup of the team. So, you know, when the team was young, we tend to use fairly strict Scrum. Nowadays, we tend to go more towards the XP. I mean, as a person, you know, I've been a Agile Scrum certified trainer and a bunch. You know, my belief is that these particular methodologies should adapt to the realities of the team. If you've got a team that needs structure, well, then let's use structure. But if you got an experienced, mature team that can figure their own things out, I don't need to be chasing after them with product backlogs and stuff like that. I just need to provide the overlevel vision. We currently work on 2-week sprints, so we still keep that basic rhythm. And we have 2 sprints per milestone. So milestones represent kind of like the product manager vision. What we want to deliver every month. And we have 2 opportunities within that month to deliver a new piece of code. We have a major and a minor version. One that delivers a bunch of new features. The other one that fixes those features. And the question is that within a month, or it's actually we have 2. We have 2. Each sprint has a production deployment. But the intent is the second production deployment for that within that milestone is intentionally minor. It's really just bug fixes or other kinds of things. Sometimes we don't even do that second production deployment. Within each sprint or milestone, we have an higher level planning session where we try to figure out. At Google, it actually works at multiple different levels. We have this thing called OKRs, objectives and key results, that sort of define what a team or a platform is going to do over the course of a quarter. And then within that, we figure out, okay, what are we going to do in each milestone? We got 3 milestones for that, that particular. By the way, not every team works this way. This is how my team works. We have 3 milestones within that quarter. Within that quarter, we then break the work up into multiple sprints. The team, again, my team is actually matured quite a bit since I first started working with them, and we don't have a very strong Scrum process because basically they don't need it. So I define what are the high-level goals for the milestone, suggest a split of work between first and second sprint, and the team basically says, all right, I'll pick that up, you pick that up, and they take care of it. We've got within that sprint, we have, like I said, we do bug hunts twice a week, not every 2 weeks, but actually 2 times per week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And then we have an acceptance period at the end of each sprint, where we do a full-blown testing pass, both automated and manual, in coordination with our integration testing team that looks not just at trafficking component, but across serving and reporting as well. Acceptance is a dual-level thing. Our team accepts it through these bug hunts, and then we have the product management team actually accept it for an official release. Did you want? I have more detail if you want it. Yeah.
As someone who's starting with AngularJS, you said that you would rewrite the code, a lot of the code, make it a lot cleaner on your second write. Could you give us some of your benefits that you've learned as we're going forward? Like just, if you can help out a little bit.
There's a lot of things. I think that 2 that come to mind. One is this notion of scope, controller separation. So if you wrote an application that's older than 6 months or so, the scope and the controller were one and the same thing, which seemed weird when we started doing it, but we just accepted it and moved along. And then at some point they made the decision that really the controller and the scope, that is what I would call from a WPF perspective, the view model, are in fact separate things. In fact, even before they did that, we were working on trying to figure out how do we expose the view model off the controller so that we can do all different kinds of interactions. So we were already kind of imagining that. If I were doing it today, of course, much of our app does not yet have scope controller separation, and it's kind of a pain in the butt. And if we were to do that again, we would definitely separate those 2. I think another thing is I talked a little bit earlier about sort of the danger of writing monolithic features. When I was working with my team, early on, I think there was a lot of resistance to giving model objects behavior. They should just be dumb, serialization objects, which is fine, but it's not really how MVC is supposed to work. And I think that, or at least many different forms of MVC. And I think as time has moved on, we kind of, as a team, convinced ourselves, it really is a good idea to move behavior into your models, move more logic outside your controllers. I mean, the classical controller is really nothing more than a wiring mechanism. that simply says, okay, when I do this, call this method on this service or this, this model. And I think that if we were to do it all over again, we'd make that more of a clear design rule and keep our controllers much more trim than they currently are. Those are the two things that come to mind.
Do we have questions in San Francisco or in Seattle? We cannot hear you, Julie.
She's passing the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
This is from Seattle. I have a question about NG show. So this is an issue I ran into earlier today. Is it possible to do an NG show on something, I guess doing a conditional within that, that directive? So for example, if I have NG show pizza, but I want to show only pizzas that are pepperoni, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the goal there is you need to expose some, method or property on there that actually represents the condition that you want. One of the nice things, about a lot of these JavaScript objects is you can just extend them with the behavior you want. So, maybe you have, if you have polymorphic pizzas, they could have a type discriminator, and you're basically doing ng show on that particular, that particular property, not really on just the whole object. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah, sounds good. Like that's what ng show is supposed to do. It's supposed to conditionally hide things based on some property or some method call on a model. So,
okay.
In short, for ng show to work, you just need to externalize the state that you actually want to drive, whether you show or hide something, not just kind of make it, indirect.
I see. Okay. And another question: is there another method to learn Angular better, like more in depth, other than the guide and the tutorial, or the documentation that's currently available on the site?
Yes, you can come out and be an indentured servant to the AngularJS team for 2 years.
So there are several videos on YouTube. If you go to youtube.com/AngularJS, there are several videos and tutorials that cover more stuff than you could see in a tutorial. We are posting, Brian, I don't know if Brian's here, but Brian Ford, he's blogging a lot about AngularJS. If you just search, if you know JavaScript Weekly, he makes it probably to JavaScript Weekly every week, and he was blogging about D3 integration and using Jade and Node.js and all kinds of stuff. So there are many resources. If you want to keep track of them, I suggest that you subscribe to our Google Plus and Twitter pages, and we usually retweet these things that we find very useful. So that's probably the best way to keep up.
Okay, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add one thing to that, which is that I've also found actually picking a couple functions and reading through the Angular code can be very helpful. Like maybe looking at how the injector works was super helpful for me.
Yeah, that's people say that they look at the Angular code and they find many idioms that they didn't know about, and the code is open source, so please read the Angular code, and it's fairly well documented, so it should be easy for you to understand what's going on there. And lastly, the meetups. In these meetups, one of the purposes why we are here is to just meet you and give you opportunity to ask questions. So come to meetups, bring questions, make a list before, and just ask us stuff. We are trying to cover every month something interesting. So like in September, we're going to be talking about directives, and we're just going to do a deep dive into how directives work and how to make the best use of them. So if you want to know about directives, come in September, and we'll talk about that.
And I have one key piece of advice to anybody new to Angular. On my team, whenever I have somebody new, we talk about the Angular way. And the Angular way is kind of a mindset of how Angular works. So the key idea is, if you're coming from a jQuery world, you're used to reaching out to the DOM and pushing changes, much more of a presenter type thing, right? Where I'm the controller and I'm doing everything. In Angular, the Angular way is represent all of your state in models and just set up the bindings, right? So your view basically says, when this property is true, then I'll show myself or then I'll hide myself. And the key point is, when you want to change the view, when you change the appearance of the application, you change the models. You don't change the view. And I think that's the key conceptual hurdle using something like AngularJS or any real MVC thing successfully.
So what's the best place to get these kind of questions, like architecture, not necessarily small technical details, but architecture, or even what's the best way to do things? What's the best forum online to, besides the Meetup, which is only like every few weeks?
I mean, I'm sure Igor has more to say about this, but I can think of a couple things. I mean, one is, AngularJS is in fact, resting on a foundation of technologies that came before. So reading about, MVC and MVP and MVVM, those patterns as a whole will help a lot. I also think for the dependency injection, reading all the information online about Juice is incredibly helpful. And as well, like there's a massive community building around Angular that's on Stack Overflow, that's on the Google Groups list. And there's some like really sharp people on that list who seem to know as much as any of us right now, even though they're not part of Google. So that would be my suggestion.
More general questions on the list and specific and Stack Overflow, you'd say? Or?
I think on the list, you'll find that beginning with a JS fiddle or some other kind of concrete problem will get you much better responses. Just saying like, well, how do I write a good AngularJS application is not going to get you as far.
Yeah, but there's always a gradient of questions. You've got like very specifics, like this thing doesn't work in my case, but there's always like you want to start right in some cases. And what about feature request? Was there a place or?
Yeah, we have an issue track on GitHub, and that's the best way to.
GitHub is the best one.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you.
So you said that you like to do test-driven development, and that if you got your way, then you just every time you save, you'd run all your tests, and everything would be awesome. But I think you mentioned that you don't get to do exactly that. So I was wondering, like, how do you get around that problem? I mean, I'm assuming it just takes too long to run them.
Yep.
So, like, what do you guys do to make sure that everything's still green, other than I mean, maybe you just do the commit thing, but what else do you do?
I mean, there's a number of different things we do. One is the Angular version of Jasmine has things like dedescribe and it that let you limit the scope of which tests will be run. So if I know I'm working on this particular part of the application, I might put a dedescribe around that block of tests, and so the only thing that are actually running are 20 tests versus 2,000 tests. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but many people on my team just kind of like abandon test-driven development, in day-to-day because they just can't do it. I can't tell how many times I've just had this face when my team tells me, yeah, I wrote the feature, now I'm going to write the tests. Well, in large part that is a struggle with. That's a result of several different things. One, we can blame it partially on the tools. It does take too long to run some of these tests. But as well, like if you're an engineer working on a new platform and a new thing, it's really hard to write the tests first. You need to like wrestle with the code and wrestle with even to understand what you're testing and what is a component. And so I think that, since my team has grown so much, we've had a lot of people that they just can't begin on this platform with test-driven development, something you arrive to. And as much as that offends my personal sensibilities, it's just a reality that we have to work with. I also think that we continue to look into solutions for how to speed this up, whether that's Testacular or other approaches. And then finally, even if we write the tests after the fact, we do in fact wait the however many minutes, several times per hour, to run all the tests, and we're not allowed to check things in unless the tests pass. So there's many fail-safes. But I would love if like running tests gave you immediate feedback, and it really was just a blink after a save.
So I have to add to this that I learned that they were having this problem just like 3 or 4 days ago when we were preparing the presentation. I was shocked and horrified that it takes so long to run the test suite, and they haven't said anything. So like when you see problems like this, tell us, because it's something that they're doing wrong. I don't know what we set up a session. We're going to figure out why is it taking so long for them to run tests. Angular itself has 1,600 tests, so the test suite is comparable. The way we wrote tests is probably slightly different. I don't know. We need to figure out what is different. But our test suite, comparable size, it takes 2 to 4 seconds to execute on modern browsers on a developer machine. So we need to figure out what's going on and fix that, because that's.
Our tests are
unacceptable.
probably a bit more DOM-centric than yours
Yeah,
are. So
but-
that contributes to at least some of the differential, but we do need to dig into why.
Wait, I think it's fixable, so we're just going to look into it.
Over here. Over here.
Do we have any remote questions?
Too dark in San Francisco.
Too dark. Everybody's sleeping in San Francisco. So we'll take a local question.
Okay.
Have you looked at your DFA and Angular on tablets? Is that a consideration at all? Or?
Yes, I would love to do it. We don't do it because our customers are not doing it. And again, it's sort of a circular argument. We look at our Google Analytics. There's like maybe 0.6% have actually attempted to run it in a tablet. And where it really manifests itself is in the negotiations we have with our UX design team, because they have all kinds of like, oh, when you hover over this or link over this and whatever, and we say, well, that's not going to work with a finger. And they go, well, we don't care because that's not what our customers do. Like, it's hard to imagine, a trafficker actually like doing this on a beach, with a tablet. But I feel like all these applications should just work in those environments, and we shouldn't make stupid design decisions that expect a mouse. But I haven't won that argument yet.
Okay. And I would just counter saying that I wonder if the reporting part of it would actually be useful on a tablet if it worked on a tablet.
Yep.
Because
and in fact, we do our reporting side of it. Not our trafficking side, does have some support for working on an iPhone. Like they have a mobile view where you can get like high-level details. But it's kind of a separate product, right? Because you're not looking for the same amount of data on a small 4-inch screen than you would be on a 30-inch desktop.
So I just want to add to that while DFA doesn't build the application for tablet, there are other companies that do. I just read a really good blog post that was written yesterday from goodmovies.com, I think. Good Movies. And they were describing, sorry? Good films? Good films. And they were this guy was describing in really great detail about how they build a mobile application with AngularJS, how they use directives to do all the touch and stuff that you expect on a mobile device. So look at that Twitter stream or Google Plus stream, and you'll find this stuff there.
Can we have a question from San Francisco?
Sure, let's do it. Yeah, go ahead, Vojta.
How you doing? I'm wondering if you.
It's really dark there, but.
I'm wondering if you guys have taken a look at the list of recent frameworks, like, for example, Meteor. I know you talked about Backbone and a couple of other ones, but are you? Well, I guess to make it simple, how would you compare Meteor and Angular?
So Meteor is trying to solve many problems that Angular doesn't try to solve right now. So the scope is much wider. It also doesn't try to be a production solution today. There are many things that they still need to work out in order to make it a solution that can be deployed in production. It's very interesting, especially the communication between the client and server. The way they solve it is interesting. I don't think their templating is as strong as what we can do with AngularJS. So going forward, what would be interesting for me is to see if Angular could be the front end for MeteorJS. MeteorJS would just do the communication with the server, all the server side.
Good answer, thanks.
We have another question in Seattle.
Okay, let's go on.
I was just wondering if you have anything in terms of key bindings and gestures and how they interact with the models. Any kind of ideas around that?
In DFA, in DoubleClick, or?
Yes.
This is a design question about how we deal with gestures. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, gestures and key bindings, and how people tab around your controls.
Yeah, so we have no explicit support whatsoever for gestures at this point, and that's related to the previous question. Our UX engineers are just not focused on supporting tablets and iPhones. As soon as we get some kind of product management direction to do that, we might invest more. Key bindings, on the other hand, we have an upcoming feature where we're going to support a lot of the same key bindings as in Gmail. JK gets you through the things, enters, opens one, and that kind of stuff. But that's not implemented yet.
All right. How often do you update to the latest version of the Angular framework? And then what type of update pains do you have, and how long does it take?
So the answer used to be as infrequently as possible. The answer nowadays is every time they update it. Because essentially our internal build system uses the latest version of the code for any component that we depend on. So whenever they update that component, we automatically get the update for good or bad. Generally speaking, though, if they were to screw up, they'd hear it from a lot of people quite immediately. Previously, though, we did update slowly, and it got to the point where it became very painful because we were on the 0.9 branch, not 0.9, the 0.7 branch.
0.9 and 0.10. So this was
Yeah.
before 1.0. Before 1.0, there were many breaking changes, and that's why they were lagging behind, because with a large application like DoubleClick, it takes a while to refactor it and resolve all the breaks. Now that we are past 1.0, the APS is stable, and it's much easier for them to just be on the latest and just get all the updates we push.
You guys have pinky sweared never to break anything ever again, right?
No comment on that.
Okay, San Francisco is waking up. Can I ask one more thing?
Absolutely.
I've heard a couple of times that we need to figure out the Angular way to achieve things. I'm fairly new to it, so my question is, what is your suggested mechanism to achieve code reuse between controllers?
Between controllers. So
Yes.
I think that this goes to the desire to sort of reduce the chance of monolithic applications. I think to the greatest extent, if you can move logic out of the controllers into models or services or custom resources, you're much better off. You make the controllers as thin as possible. In our case, we actually do have, and I don't like this, but we actually have a full-blown object hierarchy of controllers. So we've got a base controller and a base edit controller and a base, and they all do use inheritance, classical inheritance through Google Closure. In retrospect, I would not have done that the same way. It's turned out to be very painful to kind of upgrade things. If I were to choose this going forward, I'd either, again, move the code out into models and services, or use mix-ins to get the same kind of shared behavior between controllers.
Thanks.
Okay, in your experience, when is it good to use directives, and when is it not good to use directives?
It's like asking when is it good to use your hand and when is it not. I mean, it's like I can't imagine a Angular app without directives. Basically, directives.
Well, sorry, I meant when is it good to write your own directives?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I mean, when is it useful to write your own directives and extend stuff that could not do that?
I mean, the unfortunate reality we're in right now is that there isn't a massive shared code base of directives beyond AngularJS themselves. And so it's not like I can go search and find, here's 14 different versions of the same directive, and I can pick and choose which one has the best code coverage. So in many cases, we're writing custom directives all the time just because there's no other choice. But in general, writing directives is just a key piece of how you write Angular applications. The purpose of a directive is basically, it is how you communicate with the DOM. All DOM communication happens in a directive. It's, if you want to do any DOM manipulation at all, you either have to use an AngularJS directive, write your own, or find someone that does it. So, it's the nexus for all of that communication, with the view.
Related question, do you mainly stick to attribute type directives? Or are you actually writing, element type directives?
So this fantastic ability you have right now of being able to write your directives in 4 different ways was actually our feature request, because I got totally annoyed that every time I use Vim and use syntactic, and it complains every time I save it, and like, I don't recognize what ng::show is. I don't have support for namespaces and this. So one of the things we wanted to make sure is that our HTML could validate. And the only way to do that is if there was, other ways of representing these things. So currently right now we do everything as data dash, DFA dash something. And that's our path to validation.
You don't use any element directives?
Nope, they're all gone. We converted them all.
How do you use backbone models in parallel with the models that you have here? You mentioned in your slides that you use them at the same time.
No, we don't. We examined using Backbone back in the day. We don't use Backbone currently.
Now it makes sense. So you don't use it in parallel.
No.
Do we have any remote questions? Any other local questions? No one here?
I'll do a question.
Go ahead.
So you're saying when you're rewriting an app, one of the first things you could do is just modify the views separately, just make them so if you have two things that are connected, you can bind data to a particular like let's say an input box like in the examples. So you would do that first. But if you're creating a new app, you think if you're let's say like you're like me and you started using Angular last week, you're just prototyping things. Would you think it's good to just continue using jQuery a little bit here and there as you prototype, and then come up with a way to write a directive afterwards, or how would you approach creating a new application if you're used to like the jQuery way?
I would say that you need to divorce yourself from using jQuery as soon as possible. And I'm not saying this because I don't think that jQuery UI development isn't valid, but it's just not valid at all within an AngularJS application. I had an engineer, a contractor came in to develop a feature, and he kind of wrote this feature kind of half Angular, half jQuery, and it worked.
jQuery UI.
No, jQuery. I mean, he was actually mixing. He was breaking the Angular rule, and he was doing some DOM manipulation outside of directives, or doing it in directives, but in a kind of incorrect way. And it ultimately worked. But it was a dead end. Like there was no way of converting that code into something that was actually correct within the Angular way. It was just a complete, bastardization of everything AngularJS intended. And so I would say that you need to understand that directives are where you house all DOM manipulation, and you need to really abandon. If you want an AngularJS application to work and be evolvable, you just need to abandon that style of development and just focus on the Angular way.
So what were the problems? Was it reusability, or was it test coverage, or all of the above?
There were things he was doing, yes, the guy also wrote no unit tests. And I think that also was allowed him to get further into this, particular solution than he would have normally. I also think that when, for example, we updated our grid control, and because he was doing so much outward jQuery DOM manipulation, he assumed so much that he couldn't really just swap out one widget for another. There's a whole host of problems. And again, it worked, but we could not evolve it into something we could integrate into our project. And by the way, this was just a learning project for the guy, so it's not like he got fired or anything like that. It was just that in his path to understanding Angular, he went in this left veering direction, and it just turned out to be a dead end. So
when you say divorce yourself from jQuery, do you actually mean that just scope all the jQuery work or confine it within a directive?
That's exactly what I mean.
Okay.
I don't mean like you need to abandon jQuery along with all your hope. I just simply mean that if you're used to jQuery being the mechanism to do everything in an app, you need to really recognize that there are boundaries to doing that within an AngularJS application. They're limited to directives, and many of the things you used to do with jQuery are just not going to be as relevant anymore within an AngularJS app.
Hi. So I used to do I still do a lot of jQuery, and I also wrote a couple little AngularJS apps. So the key difference between Angular and jQuery is that in jQuery you're more of a manipulating, like to say, presentation, and you're operating on events. Like something happened, someone clicked the button, then you do some logic, then update the DOM. When you're going to write a fairly large and medium-sized application, you'll sooner or later realize you need some sort of a state management, and it's probably going to be some sort of object that will have something like state dot window open true, or panel open number of open panels equals to 1. So what AngularJS does, it gives you this state management in the form of model, and takes care of everything else. So it takes care of model state being reflected in presentation on the HTML page. So that's the key difference between developing developing for Angular and for jQuery. Oh, that's it.
I think that's exactly right. Just to restate it one way, that as I said earlier, the way you change UI state in Angular is you modify the model. The way you change it in jQuery is you trap some event and then go out and change the view. And those two models are not compatible.
Can I ask a quick follow-up?
Sure.
So what I use Angular for is, well, let's say create a bingo card. User types in words and it automatically converts it to an array and fills up, dynamically, like as the user types, fills up the bingo card with the words. So it's great for that. So what I reverted back to using jQuery for was to launch a modal dialog. So I guess I'll just ask you, since you have some experience with doing modal dialogues, what are some of your best practices for that? Because I know you also talked about that earlier. Thank you.
Right. So in our case, we have a service that represents a dialogue, right? And the function of that service is non-visual. Like you basically just simply say, hey, this is the moment when I want to show a dialogue, and here's some information I want to get back from it. And then that service interacts with a dialogue widget, which in our case temporarily wraps jQuery UI's dialogue. And so that widget sort of lies in wait for the service to set a property saying, oh, a dialogue should be showing right now. And that widget is constantly waiting. Can I show now? Can I show now? And as soon as that happens, it shows. And then you hit OK. And essentially what that widget does is write that state back to the service. And then now the calling controller can simply say, oh, there's been a scope event that says there's data to retrieve from that service. So it's a level of indirection. You have services work, a standard pattern I see all the time in Angular is a service working in concert with a directive. And again, that's because the service is where you want to represent shared state across controllers, and directives is where you want to manipulate DOM. And so you need to have these two things working in tandem to get it all to work correctly.
Another question in San Francisco here. So my question is around code reuse. At my company, we've been using Node.js for over a year now, and we got really comfortable with the require system, the common JS system for modularizing code. And recently with Angular, we've been using a bit of a build tool called Browserify to get require style code management on the client. So you guys are using Clojure, and I'm ignorant about Clojure. So the basic question is that comparable to the system that we've evolved?
Roughly, yes. Okay. I think Clojure basically has this notion of, all right, this file provides a particular object in a namespace, and then many different other things can require that object within that namespace. And then, when you actually compile this whole thing, it does a topological sort on all these provides and requires, figures out what order things need to go in, and it generates, a module, usually a monolithic module, unless you do something heroic. And that's what gets sent to the server. Some of these other things out there, like require.js, have a bit more support for, having submodules and being able to load certain things asynchronously in the client rather than providing a monolithic module from the server. But broadly speaking, we're doing the same thing.
Browserify is very close to how Clojure does the dependency management, and unlike require.js, like require.js is very different from Browserify.
Although require.js can actually do the same thing. It can do the topological sort and give you that monolithic.
Yeah, but you have disclosure that you have to work with, and you have to use the tools if you want to. It's different model.
Yeah,
it's a different model.
As a follow-up question to that, we've been kind of struggling to find a way to incorporate that kind of like a build system into our Angular applications. We've been trying to walk this line of how much code lives outside of the Angular framework and gets imported by this build step versus not. Is that something that you guys have had to try to figure out as well?
What do you mean by outside the Angular framework?
How do I describe this quickly? So we're representing a lot of our models in state inside of closures that get required inside of an Angular controller, for example.
I mean, for us, everything. I mean, there's very few things that are outside that main bundle, that main module, and basically it's things that don't compile well under Clojure compiler. So, for example, JQuery is from a CDN, AngularJS is from a CDN. I think underscore is also outside, but everything else is compiled into a single module because we get the benefits by Clojure compiler will drop out things that aren't used and do minification across a broader translation unit, and that's beneficial. So to the extent that we could throw everything in together in one bundle, we would. It's just some things don't play well within Clojure compiler.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hi, this is kind of a follow-up to a previous question. I'm relatively new, so let me know if this currently exists in Angular. It might exist in the future, or my question is just nonsensical. But if you have a button that, like for instance, has an on-click type event, is there a way, and it's going to instantiate a number of complicated actions, to have it send this event to numerous controllers so that they can then execute different directives that make manipulations to the DOM?
Well, so the first thing is there's not usually more than one controller going at one time in a route unless there's like sub-child controllers. Is that fair to say?
You could, but it's not common.
Yeah. So what we're really talking about is like maybe I have multiple directives that all want to react to the same event. In other words, maybe I've got 5 different graphs all on the screen that are tied to the
Let me give you an example. Suppose you have just like a number of windows. You have one controller that's going to close one window, another controller that's going to open another window, and you could have any number of these windows within a windowing system.
Do you work in financial services?
No,
because that sounds like a very
up.
financial services type solution. I mean, the key thing is, again, is you have to represent all those window states in a model somewhere or in a service, where that state exists. But essentially, somewhere you have to externalize the state of this window is open, it has this position, this window is closed. And essentially, if that button is manipulating window states, what it's really doing is manipulating that model representation of all these windows, and those windows basically just watch, for changes to that state and react accordingly.
Okay, because I come from the Flex background, and they always had to add various packages such as Parsley or robot legs and stuff like that to handle those type of situations. So I don't know. It's in my work. It's come up frequently. It's okay. Thanks a lot for the answer.
Do you have any local questions?
Now that you've been playing with AngularJS for a year and a half, is it? What would you have told the team, the Angular team, when you first started? Now that you know so much about it, what would you have changed when you first started? Now that you know.
Wow. So much. I mean, it sounds kind of thick-headed, but like so much of what Angular is today is because of a long, protracted conversation between our two teams. There's a lot of features in AngularJS that are sort of directly evolved from DFA kind of stretching the bounds of what Angular has. Much of what we have today is pretty much what I would have said back then. We continue to struggle around how do we manage the complexity of the application, but in terms of functionality and features and flexibility, I mean, I think it's pretty much what we wanted from the beginning.
I would love for you guys to open source your stuff.
I would too.
Any remote questions? Yeah, thank you.
I have a really dumb one. Okay, a really dumb one. Beginner question.
Okay.
You had talked about moving a lot of the logic out of the controllers into the models.
Yep.
But if you're getting like dumb data from the server, what's the best place to do that, or how do you do that?
There's this method called extend, and is your friend. So what you can do is you get that dumb object from the server, and then you just simply extend it. This is like a mix-in model with another object that has a lot of behavior on it. The other thing you can do, of course, is like there's other ways of converting that thing into a richer object that has behavior.
Do you just map extend across this thing, or like you have an array of whatever products, and you just want to just map it across all that stuff?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
One of the things that I was talking about with Mishko and some of my engineers over the past few weeks, we historically have used the resource service, but there's a lot of instances where you want to actually control the transformation of how things come on the wire to how things actually are exposed as models. And ultimately, the best solution for that, not that we've fully implemented it ourselves, is to write custom resources and not use the resource service. And those custom resources can do protocol transformations. And this is another area where you don't have to do a map reduce. You just when you do book.get, at that moment where you receive the wire JSON, you can extend it right there, and that's the model that's appeared. And then again, in the reverse, you can strip off all that extra code when you do the click.
Thank you, Mark, very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.